Thank you again, everyone, for being here. We're happy to have you for day 2. And we're going to kick off the day with a workshop on developing and evaluating training materials for teaching social science, environmental health collaboration, what we call the curriculum project. So today we have Rachel Dodson from the Silent Spring Institute. Well, I butchered it. I got so nervous about butchering everyone's name. Christine, now I'm going to say it wrong, Vatovec from the University of Vermont, and Jennifer Carrera from Northeastern University.
We were giggling earlier about how to pronounce all of our names, and I was saying that whenever anyone pronounces my name, they pronounce it with a Spanish accent. Despite the fact that it's Portuguese, and I'm not actually Portuguese. So, thank you all for coming. I have to say that this is one of the best conferences I've been to. There are. The other one that I really enjoyed was the Dimensions of Political Ecology conference because it was such a collegial experience. I highly recommend it for all graduate students. But something I really enjoyed about this is just the breadth of who's here and who's participating, and the opportunity to be able to speak with community organizers to grantors, from social scientists to natural scientists, doing bench work, doing ethnography. I mean, it's pretty spectacular, and we're all coming together for the same thing. Ultimately, everyone's presentation is going to the exact same place, and how spectacular is that? But I think that the curriculum project really helps us to kind of figure out that we're all doing the exact same thing, but there isn't really a discipline that we can capture that under. And that's what we're trying to do with the curriculum project. We're trying to essentially brand this as an area of scholarship that we all come under. And, it's interesting to try and brand a transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary scholarship and say this is something that we're all doing. And so we can talk about what the definitions are for social science environmental health research. And we are trying to come to a space where we kind of agree on what that means, but we do have some kind of underlying understanding of what it is that we're doing. I might add to it, kind of just the empathy and compassion that everyone's kind of coming to this project with, this big project, as everyone's really kind of looking at the world as there's something wrong, and I want to do something about it. And we never grew out of that phase where when we were little kids we said we wanted to change the world. So I thought it was interesting. So what we're doing is we're gathering a bunch of resources to help come under this branding umbrella, and we're gathering as much as we can. And so this session is going to be a very interactive session, and I also hope that you will contribute to the conference feedback review, because that's also going to capture some of the resources that we're collecting and ultimately putting under this teaching resource. And this is a resource for us who already do this. It's a resource for people like me who are essentially starting out in this, other graduate students, other postdocs, undergrads. How novel is that we could be targeting undergrads in this space, or even thinking bigger than that. But also being able to speak to a broader audience of, why is it that this is important, and why does this need to be funded, and how is it that we're coming together on this. What I found fascinating in this project, and we'll see this represented in one of the videos, and I love that video, is I didn't think that I was doing, I didn't know what social science environmental health research was until I got a postdoc with Phil, and I said, sure, that sounds great. But I love that as we're collecting these resources, you suddenly start to see, oh, I've read that, and I've read that, and I've read that, and that was one of the most influential books that I read. For me, that was one of the most influential books that I read. And so as I look through these things that have really brought us all together, it's pretty spectacular that these things are out there, but we may not all know what you're using, what you're drawing from, and if we can put that together as a tool, I think that we've got something really special that we're creating. So in that vein, one of the things that we're doing, and one of the things that you'll see in your USB drives that you got, is we're not done, but we've started collecting videos from some of the experts in the field on what they're doing, what they think of social science, environmental health research, and how do we really do this? How do we create this as, not that it's not happening, not that it hasn't been happening for decades, but how do we bring this together and have it coalesce as something that we can kind of move forward as an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary subfield? So I'm going to, on that note, I think Nancy Langston says it quite well. You're not starting the right spot.
Our first question for you today is, can you describe to us what social science environmental health research means to you?
That's an interesting question, because when I got that question, I thought, what is social science environmental health research? Because I've never heard it called exactly that. So I Googled it, of course, and realized, oh, that is what I do. So it's not a completely surprising question. To me, social science environmental health research is research into environmental health that pays close attention to the social context of health, or the social determinants of health. So race, class, gender, ethnicity, power, all the social processes that shape how people exist in the world and how their health is influenced. But another really critical component of it for me is, it also has to be, for me, environmental or social research that pays attention to the ecological context of health. And I think it's really important that both social processes and broader ecological processes get considered together. And that seems to me what's so innovative and important about this field.
Okay, bear with me as I switch between these. And it doesn't look like it's pulling these up exactly where we wanted them to. So I did have a suggestion that, because it's the morning session, that later we would do a round where we would each hum a little part of that intro song.
Well, so for a lot of years, I've been working, training social scientists to work in collaborations with environmental health scientists. And in the intestinal research group at Brown, we work together on a lot of projects. A number of them with Silent Spring Institute, a number of them with other colleagues in the Superfund Research Program and the Children's Environmental Health Center, which involved toxicologists, epidemiologists, environmental engineers. So my students had a lot of experience, as I did, in collaborating with different kinds of environmental health scientists. And we published together with them. We published in not just social science journals, but public health and environmental health journals. In turn, they too were co-authors on journals published in sociology, like Journal of Health and Social Behavior or Social Science and Medicine. And when I had the opportunity to come to Northeastern and to start a new institute, the idea was to begin an institute that would focus on that, and that would get research training grants to do this, and that would increase the number of grants in that kind of collaboration. And because I was going to sit here in two different departments, sociology and health sciences, that made it more feasible. So that's sort of the quick origin of how we got to where we are. And we have a particular NSF training grant that's geared to this exact kind of work, teaching social scientists what they need to know about environmental health scientists' work and about environmental health research ethics.
So what we've collected so far are no, I didn't want to do that, sorry. 4 videos. We have Phil Brown, Nancy Langston, Sarah Shostak, and who am I forgetting? Oh, Julie. And so each of these conversations is an interview about really how they started out as essentially pioneers in this field and how they structured their approach to this kind of research. What we're doing moving forward is we're going to be collecting more videos as case studies. So we've already approached a few people that we'd like to video record, and it's great if we can do that in person, but we're also learning through the process on how to be able to do that from a distance. One of the things that the questions that these 4 scholars were asked is, what are the benefits to interdisciplinary research? And so I'll give I'm guessing this is not going to start where I want it to. Oh, yeah, it did.
What are kind of the benefits of taking this more interdisciplinary approach to your research?
I do think that community-based research is better in many circumstances. You get better information. And to do community-based research well, you do need to combine social science and environmental science. So I think that's a real strength.
Are there any challenges to this?
It certainly is challenging to do community-based studies, and it takes more time, it takes a lot of thought. And sometimes researchers are reluctant to do it, and if they have a bad experience, they don't want to try it again. So I'm excited about the prospect of training environmental scientists to be better at it. So their experiences will be positive and they'll be willing to keep going.
She answered our next question, but I'm going to let Phil jump in and also add to what the benefits are.
Well, it's similar to what you would have in any science. You might have people who are able to detect a chemical, but they might not necessarily think about how does that chemical stay in the environment. They're very good at monitoring exposure, but they don't know what we call the fate and transport. And the engineer who might study fate and transport of that trichloroethylene in the groundwater might not know anything about the epidemiology, how is it associated with an excess of a disease or even of just symptoms. So even within science itself, scientists know that they need to have those multiple working relationships. I work a lot with the Superfund Research Program in the Children's Environmental Health Center. Those are clear examples where when NIEHS designed the Superfund Research Program, and when that's National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and when they and the EPA together designed the Children's Environmental Health Centers, they required that there be combinations of different scientists. They wisely also sought to have community outreach and research translation. And while they didn't specifically require social scientists, some of the other NIEHS grant programs did, because they knew that to get a full picture, you didn't just know how to detect the chemical, how to see where it moved in the environment, and how it affected people. You also had to know how it affected them as people in dyads and families and communities, how it affected policy and politics. And while a scientist might be involved, interested in that, they weren't trained to do that, they didn't have time to do that, and they didn't necessarily know how to get a grant to do that, and they certainly couldn't take a course or teach a course in that. So they needed the social scientists, most of whom were sociologists, some anthropologists, a handful of political scientists, a handful of economists, a lot of people in science and technology studies. So we needed each other, and we knew we needed each other to get the fullest picture. And that,
just for the second time, cut that off. And then, as Julie started, what are some of the challenges of interdisciplinary research?
What would you say are some of your greatest challenges of trying to bring these two disciplines together?
Yeah. So, I feel like there are two different categories of challenge. One is finding the opportunities to build relationships between the two disciplines, right? Because I think there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done so that people understand each other's perspectives, so that there's trust, so that there's an acknowledgement of the fact that disciplines produce knowledge in different ways and on different scales. I'm thinking in part of the model of the lone social scientist, doing her work as opposed to the large collaborations that we see in the sciences. And when I moved to Boston, one of the challenges for me was that and it's still a challenge for me, is that I don't have good networks here, right? So there are people who I know and trust in New York and in the Bay Area, and sort of rebuilding that series of relationships here is a next challenge for me. It's sort of, in the next several years, something I really want to be working on. The other piece of this, and I know that Phil's thought and written a lot about this, is helping your home discipline make sense of interdisciplinary work, especially in regards to really concrete things like promotion and tenure. So one of the suggestions that was made to me is that sociologists talk about public sociology, about making sure our work reaches audiences beyond the academy. This is actually a framing from my postdoc mentor at Columbia. Peter Vermont said, I need to figure out ways to convincingly make the case that scientists and clinicians are publics too. And they, rather than thinking about, how do I get my work into Time magazine, though that would be great also, it's how do I get my work into venues where scientists and clinicians might read it and take it seriously. And his suggestion was actually that as I build up my publications record, that I split my CV so that I have the work that's clearly sociological in one list, and then the work that's my public sociology, right, which will be in medical journals and hopefully will be in environmental health perspectives and will be in journals read by scientists and clinicians, will be a separate category. I'm actually up for tenure this year.
And got it.
What Sarah gave there, though, was a really concrete example of how to strategize and how to think about how to bring these things together. And actually, in a few minutes, we're gonna do kind of a workshop session with you where we're gonna ask you for those kinds of concrete things and your own experiences and your own recommendations or things that you wish that you had that you think that might be beneficial to other scholars as they begin. Nancy likes to finish.
Well, the greatest challenges, of course, are trying to just figure out what's going on. The biggest challenge is ending up with a very superficial analysis because you don't really know the models or the assumptions or the mathematics or the literature, what's already been done in other fields. And that's as true for molecular biologists trying to learn a little sociology as it is for historians trying to learn a little molecular biology. Things change so quickly and you just can't keep up with the literature. So that leads to one of the biggest opportunities, which is you can't do it all yourself, so you need to be working with other people. And so I think a huge opportunity is forming teams asking a question where interdisciplinary approaches lead to something better than what you could do on your own. So, for example, I think there are lots of questions where if you try and answer the question from just within one discipline, you'll sometimes come up with the wrong answer because you're ignoring the insights from other disciplines. So one quick question, one of my grad students working on forest health was trying to figure out why white pine was vanishing from much of northern Wisconsin. And most ecologists had assumed it was because of the white pine blister rust. Currents were brought over as part of the nursery trade almost a century ago. They brought fungus, and that spread. And so foresters were kind of working on the assumption you couldn't get white pine back. But what Michelle did was, she's part of a landscape ecologist, but part an environmental historian. And she looked at a set of sources, archival records from the tribes, forestry plans in the 20s and 30s, and realized that there actually was a huge amount of white pine regeneration, in part because the young Indian men were employed as laborers to pull out the currents. And then when that got too expensive, when the war started, they were sent off to war. And then at the same time, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs really decided aspen was what we all needed for a healthy forest because it was healthy for the pulp industry, for paper. I mean, it was healthy, but in a different way than purely ecological health. So really it was a set of political and social decisions that led to dramatic changes in forest health. And so she couldn't have figured that out just as a social scientist. But the ecologists also couldn't figure out just on their own. They really needed to have a team of people asking the same question but looking at it from different angles. And I think that's true for lots of questions in broader questions of environmental health as well.
Okay, so I'm going to switch over to Christine, and we're going to do a little bit of this brainstorm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jennifer. So now comes the interactive part. that we've been promising you, and a few different things. I'm going to hand out a piece of paper for you, and Jennifer's going to hand out. Maybe leave me one so I know exactly what the questions are. And on the top you'll see, we'll give you a minute to kind of work through this. On the top you'll see, if you would not mind telling us who you are, your name. We're going to ask, where are you right now? What are you doing? Have you used this type of approach before? Give us a little description of how you've been working in this type of collaboration. Would you benefit from having this type of collaboration if you haven't done it before? And then we're going to transition into a problem vignette where we'll kind of work through it together. And we want to remind you a few things. So Jennifer had mentioned that yesterday at registration you got a flash drive, and on the flash drive it has all of the interviews we've conducted so far. It has lists of syllabi that are available, lists of books, what are the articles in this area right now. It is not exhaustive. So some of the things that we're hoping to get from you today are ideas about other resources that are out there. Or, alternatively, what needs do you have from your particular perspective on the things that would be useful to you? And those flash drives are an opportunity for us to go out into the world, back to where we've come from individually, whether an academic institution or a research facility or a community, and use these tools with other people to share, right? So here are some of the experts in this field. What are they saying about why it's useful to have this approach? What might we be able to do with the information that we have so far? And then how can we grow this? How can we provide the tools and resources that are necessary to help train future collaborators from all these different perspectives? And I'll say specifically that the things that we're really missing right now, we have a lot of the academic tools, but we're definitely interested in increasing the amount of tools that we have from the community partner piece as well. So we're very interested in, from anybody's perspective, what are the tools and resources available to help train community members in these types of approaches as well. So take a minute just to jot down some of those initial pieces. Yes, please.
When you first put up the slide defining social sciences, when you had the definition on the first slide, I leaned over and made a comment to Phil, but I'd like to say to the group, which is that you left off a couple social sciences that I think are critical in this field, which is geography and economics. And it would be great to expand that, because especially when you're talking about social determinants of health. And I attended a workshop with Phil at Brown, the Superfund Research, where they brought in economists, and they're really people who would benefit from an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach, because they're not applying their economic philosophies in a way to real life situations. But also geography. One of the slides I showed yesterday where they named the different ethnic groups, that was done by a geographer, and he's an integral part of one of our projects. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, we have another comment.
Well, I would just add, if we're looking at interdisciplinary, we were a community partner. We work closely with Tufts Environmental and Civil Engineering. So I would suggest that engineering departments, I also know being here at Northeastern, the law school has a student part. I don't have a relationship with them, but we have talked with them in the past about bringing in Northeastern law students around environmental issues as a place where the communities and the researchers could use support in terms of policy.
Thank you for your comments, and we welcome comments throughout what we're doing here. As you're finishing up some of those initial thoughts, and please feel free to continue writing, we're going to invite you all, whether or not you've ever heard of Steve Wing and his work with industrial hog farming, we're going to ask you to kind of forget that you've heard of it before. We're going to ask you to think about it with fresh eyes from your perspective, whatever perspective it is that you're bringing today. We're going to do this as a problem vignette. We're going to kind of work through this particular problem. We're going to hear Steve Wing in several segments of a presentation that he gave at a TEDx talk. And he's going to first describe the problem. And when he's describing the problem, it's industrial hog farming and what are the human health effects of that to neighbors of this farming community. And we're going to ask you to kind of think from your perspective, what's one aim that you would have to approaching this question? What's the challenge that you see? And then what's a method that you might use from whatever perspective you're coming from that would help approach that question that you have? So think about it in those terms. Is that too loud? Yeah.
The way we eat doesn't just affect our health. It affects other people's health too. Hog production in North Carolina is a good example. Since the mid-20th century, livestock production has shifted from pasture-based farms to factory operations. There are hundreds to over 1,000 pigs in each building. The feeders are automated, and giant fans blow the waste gases and dusts out of the buildings. Ventilation helps the pigs, but it results in air pollution for their human neighbors. Many of us know more about the inhumane treatment of livestock than about inhumane treatment of people living nearby. Liquid and solid waste are flushed into open lagoons. Then it's sprayed out on nearby fields. Here are the three main components of a typical industrial hog operation: the confinements, the lagoons, and the spray fields. Notice the house nearby in the upper right. Liquid waste is supposed to stay on site, but rain is a problem. North Carolina is in the path of tropical storms. In 1999, Hurricane Floyd affected hundreds of industrial animal operations in eastern North Carolina. Here, plumes of feces and urine are streaming out of breached lagoons, and pigs are flooded out of confinements. Along with the factory farms come the slaughterhouses. Smithfield's plant in Tar Heel, North Carolina, employs 5,000 workers to slaughter 36,000 hogs per day. These jobs are dangerous, but workers need the money. Hog, beef, poultry, dairy, and egg production are now highly industrialized. In 2010, 97% of the hogs in the U.S. were housed in facilities with more than 500 head. I study occupational and environmental health, and sometimes people call me about problems with pollution. In 1995, I began to meet neighbors of industrial hog operations. I saw how close some neighborhoods are to hog operations, like this one in the upper right. People told me about contaminated wells, the stench from hog operations that woke them at night, and children who were mocked at school for smelling like hog waste. People also told me about the horrible odor from dead boxes, with festering carcasses that attract buzzards and flies. I studied the medical literature and learned about the allergens, gases, bacteria, and viruses released by these facilities, all of them capable of making people sick. And I talked with people like Elsie Herring, who described what it's like to live near an industrial hog operation.
They're blowing animal waste on us, so you really can't stay out there long enough to do anything but your eyes start wearing water, you start coughing and gagging, you feel like you want to throw up, and trying to hold your breath to at the same time, trying to get to and from your destination. They're just taking every freedom that we have away from us. And we're just supposed to become complacent and say, oh, this is okay, this is just the way, a normal way of living. But they're not breathing it in.
I agreed with Elsie and other residents who said this was wrong, and I wanted to use my skills and resources to help document what was happening.
All right, we're going to pause here because we want you to think in that same way. What are the skills and resources that you might bring to this type of question? And the reason that we're collecting this information, we want you to jot a few thoughts down. We want to collect this from you because we think that there's going to be a really broad diversity of specific ideas and approaches and thoughts about how each individual might come to this. And we're going to collect that back either at the end of today, or if you want to continue thinking about it, you can hand it in at the registration table later on. But we want to be able to collect this so we can see what are all the broad opportunities that we have as a community to combine our resources. What are all the tools that we need to train people in to be able to use these approaches from all those different perspectives. So take a minute, think about what is your perspective on this? How might you approach this? And what's a method that you might use from your perspective to approach this question? Now we're going to use one of those classic pedagogical tools that help people talk. We're going to just ask you for just a second to see you can articulate to yourself what it is that you're thinking. Turn to your neighbor. Maybe it's someone you've never met before. Please introduce yourself. And share one idea that you have from your discipline. Share what your discipline is, where you're coming from, and what's one thing that you see in this problem where you could help out. What's one approach you would use? Conversation. We do want to pull you back. I'm going to pull you back with the little clapping exercise. Oh, you guys are better at it than I am. Okay, great. All right, we've got everybody back. Excellent. We do want to hear from a few folks just to see broadly what are some of the ideas that you were thinking of right now. Who would like to share? I'm sure there's a broad opportunity here. And please tell us who you are, kind of where you're coming from, and what's your idea.
Hi, my name is Luce Huntington-Moscas, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Louisville School of Nursing. And I study youth, adolescents in particular, so my specific aim was, and of course it's a rough draft, examine the biological markers and self-report measures of stress among children and adolescents living near industrial hog farms. And I was interested in the method of biomarkers and studying the cortisol levels and the C-reactive protein for like an inflammation marker.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. How about another perspective?
Hi, I'm Laura Carrera from the National Code for Neuroethics. And one of my specific aims was to study the values underlying in the community, both in terms of how they value their environment, how they value their health, how they value their occupation, and through that analysis to see why they came to where they are in that type of production facilities. The method is a little bit more tricky to describe, but yeah, I have to think a little bit more on that one.
Great, thank you. We have some folks back here.
Yeah, I'm Mary Duggan. I'm interested in genetically modified organisms. I happen to know that in Canada they developed a pig with salivary glands that reduce the waste. So I'd like to know how the economic demands force different ethical and environmental changes to the animals. And then as a 30-year vegetarian and many-year vegan, I'd like to do a Stop Eating Bacon campaign to try to stop the demand on the actual, because I think that's something we can each individually do starting tomorrow, and I think that's an important advocacy.
Excellent, thank you.
Hi. From a perspective of sociology of risk or sociology of organization, I would like to understand the role and interplay of the different actors, from the distributors, the farmers, the mayors, the regulators. From the beginning, so in allowing the farming to exist, monitoring its development, to the end, to today, how it's operating. And the methods, I think, we'll use as kind of a process tracing, combining the public policy process, the decision-making process, agenda setting, but also the economic process of how they got the investment, the money, till the monitoring of the implications, so who is suffering from the workers to the neighbors. And I think also in this process tracing, I will look at science, so which are the scientific paradigms that are used either to justify or to fight against those types of farming. Thank you.
Excellent. And we have time for...
Cécile Wenling from the Center of Sociology of Organization in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have time for one more, if anyone would like to share a different perspective.
Okay. Hi, I'm Colleen Murphy. I'm from actually the University of Puerto Rico, but I'm from North Carolina. And Stephen Wing was a professor of mine. I'm a doctoral student in social determinants of health and public health, so my aim would be more sociologically based. I'm going to sit down. This is a very poor area of the state, and I don't know if anybody else here is from North Carolina, but it's mostly African American and Latinos who have immigrated. So there's a huge environmental justice issue in North Carolina, as well as, I would use a political economic framework. The North Carolina government is a mess right now. And the lobbyists of the pig farms is never going to go away. So maybe using life stories, I would interview the people who work in the factories as well as the community members. So, thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Wow, look at this. Already we're seeing a really broad diversity of approaches that we could use to collectively attack this problem. Now what we're going to return to Steve's presentation, and we're going to hear the methods that he actually used. And when we're listening to this, I want you to think about the things that you've just heard our community talk about, the things that you had written down, and think about where are the overlaps, and just kind of, out of curiosity, what did we miss that he did differently?
With other scientists from universities and government agencies, I partnered with community-based organizations that understand hog country and are trusted by residents. In one study, funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, we took a trailer full of air pollution monitors to 16 neighborhoods where people lived within 1.5 miles of between 1 and 16 industrial hog operations. Every week, we downloaded hourly measurements of hydrogen sulfide, a toxic gas produced by the decomposition of fecal waste that smells like rotten eggs. We also measured concentrations of particles small enough to enter the lungs. While we measured the pollutants, groups of neighbors participated in a health study. At pre-selected times, every morning and evening for 2 to 3 weeks, they sat outside on their porches for 10 minutes and rated the odor during the past 12 hours in their diary. Back inside, they recorded physical symptoms, feelings of stress and anxiety, and daily activities. And they measured their lung function and blood pressure using these digital instruments that stored the data. What did we find?
So I'm stopping it here just because I want to just remind us, what are some of the things that he used that we didn't think about, right? So here's the value of having this collaborative community. We didn't hear about some of those monitoring pieces, but I'm sure people in the audience may have been thinking about those things. But having that type of expertise is just as powerful as having some of the social things that we're hearing about, the economic pieces. But we need all those pieces to fit together to understand a bigger picture of what's happening. So we're going to hear a little bit about the results, and then what we're going to hear is why having that community piece was so important in this work. And then we're going to stop and move on. So here come the results, and then Steve's perspective on community involvement.
Neighbors know what hogs smell like. This graph shows average hourly odor ratings from 1 a.m. on the left to midnight on the right in yellow. And see how well they track the hydrogen sulfide concentrations, shown in red. Levels of gases and particles recorded by the pollution monitors were related to respiratory symptoms, lung function, irritation of the eyes and nose, stress and anxiety, and residents' ability to engage in daily routine activities. This figure shows that as the hog odor during the 10 minutes they spent outdoors increased from faint to moderate to strong, participants' blood pressure, measured just a little while later indoors, also increased. Our research has taken place in predominantly African American communities, where people pointed out that hog factories would never be built in rich white communities. They said industrial hog production was another case of what's been seen before in North Carolina: environmental racism. Industrial hog production began in the 1970s. As the number of factory farms increased and small farmers were driven out of business, the size of North Carolina's herd increased dramatically. By the late 1990s, when a moratorium was put into place after a hog
Okay, we're going to stop it here, simply for the interest of time. And we invite you to go to Steve's presentation to see the rest. It is a very useful teaching tool. I have used this in some environmental health courses as well. And I'm seeing some folks nod heads who probably used it too. And we want now to shift in thinking about, right, all these different perspectives that we're hearing about. We want you to think about a project that you are interested in taking on yourself. Here's some of those things that we were talking about before. What are the various disciplines and methods that we might use for approaching social science, environmental health research? Making sure that we include that environmental justice piece, environmental racism. And keeping all of those things in mind, we want you to have an opportunity to, again, take a moment, think about a project that maybe you've had it on the back burner for a while, maybe it's something that's very present in your life, maybe it's something you're already working on. From the tools and resources that you've been hearing about, what are some other opportunities for approaching that question that you have? If you've never done this type of research before, it's kind of your opportunity to think about your dream project. If you have been doing this research before, what have you learned so far in this conference yesterday, a little bit of what you're hearing today, that might better inform the approach that you are taking? And take a minute just to think about, what is the problem that you are interested in? What are the questions you want to investigate? And what are the methods that so far you have been using, you would like to use, new things that you're hearing about, and some of the resources that you might need to make that happen. So take a minute to think about that. Now that you have that project deeply in mind, on the second half of the sheet, you see that space for the tools and resources for supporting these different approaches. And now is an opportunity for you to start thinking about what are the things that this curriculum project can help you with, either in terms of what are some of the tools and resources you can offer, what are the tools from community partners, what are the tools from academics, what are the tools from the institutions, how can we all work together on this type of problem. Start helping us by filling in some of those pieces so that we can collect all that data and then share it back with this community. We're going to visit this dream project again. Okay, yes, please.
One thing, I am social sciences, environmental health person. I have public health background and biochemistry and toxicology and environmental governance and all that. But one thing I don't hear, and I haven't heard entire day yesterday or today, is political science. And I think that's the piece that is missing, because none of us understand the political decision-making processes, the level somebody who is studying political science, and that way it can help us influence the new policies and changes.
Excellent, thank you. What other immediate needs? We'd like to have a bit of a discussion right now in terms of some of those ideas, either from your perspective of your dream project, breaking it down into those pieces. What do you need from your place that you're coming from? What are the tools and resources that you need? So we need some more political science. What are some of the other things that we might need for this community in training people as we move forward?
I think that so many people use the Anna Haynes data as a reference for average health parameters, that I think that's an incredible resource that should be included. And certainly there are other CDC and NIH resources that, because you mentioned institutions, I wasn't sure if you meant government as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So I think, I kind of think of it from the other direction, what is the goal of this?
Mm-hmm.
What are you really trying to accomplish? Because in order to shut this kind of an operation or any kind of an operation down that's affecting an impacted community or an environment, you have to get to the user. Because, you can, all of this stuff that you guys are talking about is extremely important, all of this data collection and studying. But you've got to be able to figure out a way, I think this kind of ties into what you're saying, to reach that user and get them to not eat the bacon that's coming off these kind of factory farms. So, and as somebody who works with these communities and tries to stop this kind of development, it's great to say work with the community group, but it's really expensive to get people out into the field to do this kind of work. Quite frankly, we don't have any money. So when you're getting an army to go out there and do all these interviews and whatever kind of whatever you're looking for in the field, it's getting harder and harder to be able to do that because it's expensive. And then you have to be able to take it again to those communities who really, you might look at this and say, oh, this is really horrible, but you still go home and fry the bacon, So you've really got to get to those users, and I think it's extremely important to get to children who do care about things like this, and start training them about ethical food production or ethical energy production or whatever your issue is.
Thank you.
So I would just want to piggyback on both of those, because I think there is a whole political thing. We had a big discussion in the breakout session today on Wyoming and the government of Wyoming reflecting the government of North Carolina, stepping in and saying, we're not going to allow you to test on public lands. In other words, they're one step ahead of us all the way. I think that, just looking at excluding NIEHS and a couple of the other centers, most of our taxpayer dollars go to research drugs to cure diseases that are being caused by problems we're talking about right here, which is kind of outrageous. So how do we sort of get that? Because the individual stories they're horrifying, but we live in a country where people find it very easy to ignore all of these things. So I think we have to think, a little more strategically and larger.
Thank you.
So kind of in line with what you just said, that it costs so much money to deploy folks in the field to collect data, I think that groups and successful collaboratives can also just leverage secondary data sets that are out there. I mean, I'm fortunate to be from a state where there has a lot of data that we've been able to successfully use in kind of what I like to call a data judo fashion, without having to go out there and collect primary data to really examine the questions that organizers think are important, without having to just overburden community partners with extensive field work and data collection activities. So I think sometimes there's some really useful low-hanging fruit in terms of data resources to do the kinds of analyses and answer the kinds of scientific questions that can inform advocacy and organizing. Then the second question, or the second issue I just want to put out there, I'm a scientist, and this is always kind of a controversial thing to say, but I always say it, which is you really have to step back and ask yourself, is the scientific project really necessary at this point? Or is it that we really are, the resources we need in terms of social sciences, a little bit about what you said, do we need a political strategist? Do we need communication strategy help to really sort of develop a campaign? Because the science is there, and the question is really how do we leverage the knowledge that we already have to move and change the conversation and create that shift that we need to have policy and regulatory reform.
Can I respond to that?
Oh, I actually want to respond to something you said, Deb, and I'm glad you used the word army, because I want to mention that there are national movements and there's organizations that transcend states around causes. And in fact, one of our breast cancer and the environment programs tapped into the army of women who are already mobilized. They didn't have to organize a group. They went to a group that is eager to participate, and so that's one way to leverage those, not need to recruit people or send people out into the field.
And just to say that the first thing I would do be start looking for the groups that are in northern South Carolina that are doing alternative agricultural models, organic, and there are some really good ones, African American based, and just see where they are, what they need to meet with that community and start making those connections for the next few years. That's one thing that I'd make sure I would make some kind of connection through the church. Organizations, and make sure every little kid in Sunday school gets a baby stuffed pig to play with and there's conversations. I mean, I would start working in very grassroots ways, but start working what's already out there. It's not for us to come in and say, we have some answers for you.
Right.
Because there are people that are looking at this for quite some time and very, very, very well.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a couple more in the back, and then we'll meet the microphone over here.
So this is really interesting. This has been a really interesting conversation over the last 2 days because of how we think in terms of what we do. So like when I was saying we need to, it's really expensive to have people in the field collecting, I don't know if I said collecting data, I may have, but I wasn't talking about science data. I was talking about the stories and the stuff that happens to people who are living there. Right? And so, and that's really expensive.
Yeah.
Yes. You know. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. We have time for two more. We have one in the back here.
Okay. So what I'm going to say kind of builds on some of the conversation before. I think, and also ties into the previous question. So one of my goals, something this would be to think about the ultimate goals, which would be social change. And one of the methods I would use is to get a better understanding of what the regulatory history has been over time, and just tracking over time, and whenever there has been changes, kind of hone in on that particular story to get a sense of who the actors were, what mechanisms did they use to try to alter the course of that particular battle, so that we have a better sense of where the levers of potential change are. And then in terms of needs, I think one of the things, someone talked about economists, and one of the things I'm going to be trying to do is build relationships with ecological economists who are already hone in on those issues so that they can internalize the costs, so that when we have those political conversations, when we have political scientists who are advising, we have a better sense of the tools so we can speak the lingo. Unfortunately, a lot of the decisions are made on dollars, in terms of economic values, and I think it's really important to be able to speak that language and to be able to have the costs that are internalized, that are normally are externalized, that enable bad policy to be made. So.
Thank you. And we have time for one more. There's a woman up here who's been waiting very patiently. And for the rest of you, I will ask you to please write these things down. And write down, this is just incredible. I really appreciate all these different ideas that are coming. Please, Rachel, write down those ideas about where are those data sources. Write down churches, right? Those aren't things that we had initially thought about, but what are all those different connection points that we should be making sure that people are aware of to connect to their community?
Hi. I'm really struggling with this, and I think in a different way than many of you are, because I am not actually an academic. I am a community organizer that realized there's a health issue in the area, and the purpose of me actually coming to this conference is that I'm trying to understand what it is that you're struggling with so that somehow we can reach this, bridge our struggles together and work together. So I'm having the opposite problem that you're having. In trying to engage academics to get interested in the stories that I'm noticing in my community. And I think that perhaps there's some insight in what my challenge is right now, so I apologize that I'm struggling so much. But a lot of you are talking about collecting stories, but I just want to point out the fact that there's a huge difference about collecting stories and empowering stories. When you're collecting stories, we're just research subjects, and that doesn't do anything for us. But when you empower our stories, and I think the practice that you're even having right now is that you're actually even holding a workshop to discuss these topics among academics and researchers. But perhaps, and maybe you do this, I don't know, but if you go into communities and you have a similar workshop where you actually seek out, like, what are the questions that the community individuals have? Because perhaps for you that is really, intuitive knowledge, but for us that's something completely different. So I don't know if this is even making sense, but I just
absolutely,
it's a totally different language and a totally different experience from what we have as residents that haven't. Many are in trades and haven't gone to university or college. So. Anyways, I'm not sure that I was even
this is
addressing
incredibly
your question,
useful because the curriculum project is not just for academics. It's for all these groups of people coming from all these different perspectives. And so knowing what your needs are just as important as knowing what the needs are of the academic community, because some of your questions, to me, I'm hearing that just how to connect with the academic community and people who will bring that piece while you have the strength from your perspective, and how do we form those collaborations. So knowing just that need in general is incredibly useful, and any ideas that you have or anyone else has in answer to that, here's one way that I've connected with my people before, so that we can just provide those resources in terms of what might one way be. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I just feel it's such like a top-down approach of, let's collect your stories so then we can research it, as opposed to coming to us and really learning from us. Like, if that makes sense.
Sure, yes. And that is community-based participatory action research and community-based participatory research in general. Absolutely. And so, there are these academic tools for this type of research, but it's how to speak those languages, how to get away from the jargon that's involved in all these different disciplines, so that we can come at the same big picture problem from these different angles to try to chip away at it.
Yeah, thanks for your patience.
No, of course, this is incredibly useful. Thank you. And someone's dying to add one last thing.
We work together. So we had this long conversation last night, because I am a former practitioner and now academic. And I went back to school for the very reason that I felt that there needed to be a voice for the practitioners of the community. And I hear it even here. I know you are much more ahead than, for instance, my department at the University of Waterloo, even though we talk about participatory. But I am the one who is bringing in people, actual practitioners, saying, how can we serve you? Like, as an academic, how can we serve the communities? Because we're making a lot of guessing on behalf of the community. And I think a little bit what Anna was trying to say too is that in this exercise, it would be, if we really mean participatory, we should have at least half of the room community non-academics. So that's just...
And you're linking up one really important partner, and that's the impact of people.
That's what I meant. That's the community. I mean, the stakeholders who are influenced. Is it even the organizations, but the participants, but the community?
I just realized that on that sheet and also on your feedback form, there isn't somewhere to say what type of organization you're from or what discipline you're from. So while you're filling out this sheet, if you could add that, that would really help us in terms of our assessment of who's here, if we could have that picture. I know that we do have a number of community organizations and community members here, but
just ask for a show of hands.
I think that's a great idea, and I would love to see that, but I would also love to have it written down. So I do.
Yeah, we can do it. Would you like to do a show of hands for percentages of people who are here from different areas? Sure, yeah. So how many people here today are here representing a community organization or community affected people? Okay. So we have a small cadre.
And how many people are actually impacted?
How many of you, yes, great question. How many of you have been impacted by particular problems?
Everybody, raise your hand.
How many people are here from an academic setting? And how many people are here from government settings? And is it, how many people are something other that I have missed? Okay, so we do have some workshop. I'm very happy that you're pointing out this need. And so when you're telling us some feedback, how did you find out about this conference? How can we reach other organizations? What are some of those avenues that we maybe aren't aware of in terms of trying to get more people involved in this broad approach? We know our own communities that we work with, but we don't necessarily know how to get these tools to communities that we haven't worked with before. Sima.
On almost every single community engaged project that we fund, we have the lists of community organizations across the country who are involved, so government's a good source of that information.
Excellent.
Also EPA, extensive CDC, extensive lists of community organizations.
Excellent. Thank you. If you might be able to jot down those resources and what are the specific places where we can point people to for finding those groups, that would be a useful component to add to this curriculum as well. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit here and just kind of give a broad overview of some of the tools from the academic side of things that we have available in the curriculum project. I'm going to hand it over to Robin.
Okay. So the idea here is that, right, you guys have been doing a lot of brainstorming and thinking about the different kind of transdisciplinary approaches that we can have. The other idea with this curriculum project is actually to provide kind of a primer in the methods that people use, basically so we can all speak the same language. So if you hear, standardized incidence ratios, you know what the heck we're talking about. So I'm, as an environmental health scientist, I'm here to give you a very quick primer on the environmental health parts, methods, and concepts. And so when we think about environmental health methods, right, we're thinking about some sort of hazard in our environment, moving towards exposure and then moving towards a health outcome of some sort, right? And there's many disciplines that are coming into this, even disciplines within the science field, right? So we have freight and transport, we talked about that, the engineering component.
We have what I do a lot, which is the exposure science, which is understanding, okay, what's in the environment, how might I be exposed to it? And then once you're exposed, how then we can use tools from toxicology, so that's testing things in the laboratory, or epidemiology, that's looking at health outcomes in populations, to then assess some sort of health outcome of interest or of concern. And all of this, of course, is mediated by both susceptibility within the community as well as vulnerability in the community. So these are kind of some key kind of terms and disciplines within the environmental health discipline itself. So very briefly, is exposure science, and this is something where, my specific aim for the hog farming was characterize the exposure to the gases and the particles, because this is my kind of way that I come to the project. But exposure science it's a whole discipline in itself. It's bridging making a bridge between the sources of the biological, chemical, or physical agents and actually health. So it's taking things out in the environment, thinking about how we encounter those in some way. Do we inhale it, ingest it? Is it applied dermally? To all these different types of sources that we might encounter. And then once it gets into your body, then we think about something, what the potential health effects could be, right? So we have things like toxicology. And toxicology is thinking about adverse effects to chemical, physical, and biological agents. Usually this is done in a laboratory setting, right? We think about what we call ADME, which is how the agent gets into our body, how it's distributed, what our body does to it in terms of metabolism, and then how we get rid of it if we can. And this is typically done in the laboratory settings just simply because that's more of a controlled setting. But we combine that toxicological information sometimes, if it's available, with the idea of studying the epidemiology. Now this is looking at the distribution and determinants of disease in a population, usually of people. And so this is another area or discipline that we need to bring to the table, right? Steve Wing was an epidemiologist. That's what his perspective was when he was coming to the hog farming. So we can think about what the epidemiological methods might be that we could contribute to this type of approach. So we just want to briefly show you and this is an example of some tools, I guess, that we would put on our website, for example.
Epidemiology is the study of the characteristics of people who get certain diseases and how often certain diseases occur in our communities and why. We use epidemiologic information to monitor the occurrence of disease in our communities, to understand the possible causes of those diseases and possible treatments. And we also use it to monitor how effective our prevention programs are working.
So that's one definition, and then we have, I like this one when I found it.
Imagine the following experiment. He took a room with a surgical table and he put a can of sardine on the table. And he asked a neurosurgeon, a pathologist, and an epidemiologist to come. And the experiment was very simple. They had to go into the room, do whatever they wanted.
Statistics for research and for the...
Sorry about that.
So the neurosurgeon went first, stayed 2 minutes, came out, he had written can of sardine on his paper, and the box of sardine was very nicely open. There was not a drop of oil on the table, and they didn't care about looking at the sardines themselves. Then goes the pathologist, stays half an hour, comes out, he's full of oil everywhere. The can is roughly open, very strangely. There are bits of sardine all over the table and oil. And he has a 2-page report. This was a metal can, and I opened it according to the procedure so-and-so. There were 6 sardines. I opened them all. There was nothing pathological, and I think it was, safflower oil or something like that. Sunflower. So he gives his report. Then goes the epidemiologist. The epidemiologist stays 8 hours. So the guy I was starting to get worried. After 8 hours, the epidemiologist opened the door. He looked exhausted. So immediately the guy looks at the table and sees the can of sardine untouched. but the epidemiologist had a 20-page report on how to estimate the number of sardines in the box without opening it.